Much of the discussion about the Ground Zero Mosque on YouTube is abstract. What I mean is people in other countries are weighing in on this subject, like Pat Condell, who's from Britain. And I haven't seen a lot of contributions from people who are Americans and who actually live in New York. This whole notion of a Ground Zero Mosque is a bit of a misnomer. The mosque is actually, the proposed mosque is not actually on Ground Zero. It's not, in the ruins of the World Trade Center or anything like that. It's about 2 blocks north of Ground Zero. And I took a trip down to the site from the proposed mosque site and walked to Ground Zero to give people a concrete sense of exactly what kind of distance we're talking about, and to show that almost 10 years later, Ground Zero is still just basically a big hole in the ground. So why is it controversial? Why is there even a controversy? That's the first question that I asked myself when I started seeing headlines in the newspaper about Ground Zero Mosque controversy. Why is it even controversial? It's a place of worship. What is so controversial about building a place of worship somewhere? The opposition to the mosque being near Ground Zero is frankly based on Islamophobia. It's based on racism. And the underlying idea behind the opposition to it is that by building a mosque so close to Ground Zero, somehow we're disrespecting the dead. We're disrespecting the 2,000 to 3,000 people who were murdered that day on September 11, 2001. This argument flows from a flawed understanding of why 9/11 happened in the first place and what motivated them to do what they did. The opposition to the mosque near Ground Zero basically claims that religion, or more specifically Islam, is the reason 9/11 happened. This is radically false for a number of reasons. First of all, Islam is a religion that is well over 1,000 years old. The phenomenon of suicide bombing that is today associated with Islam is something that is recently developed in the last maybe 50, 60 years or so. The second point is about the hijackers. The hijackers were not pious Muslims. Before the 9/11 attacks, they were drinking alcohol, going to strip clubs, patronizing prostitutes, and buying pornography. That's in addition to violating Islam's rule against suicide. Most of the world's major religions don't allow their followers to commit suicide. And on top of that, there's nothing in the Quran that says the mass murder of non-combatants is okay. So on almost every level, the hijackers and their actions really have nothing to do with Islam, Islamic teaching, or anything of the sort. The hijackers used religion as an excuse, as a justification for what they did. But that was not the root cause of the 9/11 attacks. The 9/11 attacks were not the act of pious Muslims. The 9/11 attacks were above all a political act by members of a political movement, or organization rather, Al-Qaeda. Since 9/11, Islamophobia has become really rampant in American society. A right-wing blogger who is associated with the teabagger movement, her name is Pamela Geller, has taken out ads on the sides of the local public transit. And these signs read, "Fatwa on your head, is your community or family threatening you? Leaving Islam?" And this ad directs Muslims to a website urging them to leave, quote-unquote, the falsity of Islam. This is a clear example of hate speech. People are not Muslims because their family is threatening them or because there's a fatwa on their head. It's because they actually believe in the teachings that are in the Quran and so on and so forth. I'm an atheist, by the way. I don't believe them, but I understand why other people believe it. And this, in my view, is a pretty clear example of hate speech, and that's why the Detroit bus system rejected the leaving Islam ads. Now, this kind of Islamophobia, this hate speech against Muslims, people can dismiss it and say, oh, it's just, yeah, people are just disagreeing with Islam or disagreeing with Muslims or criticizing their beliefs. It's harmless. It's purely religious criticism. But that is far from the truth. Here in New York also, there was a recent case where a man named Kamal Uddin, a Bangladeshi construction worker, was savagely beaten in broad daylight on his lunch break from his construction job. And he was not robbed. He had all of his belongings, his watch, his wallet, jewelry, cell phone, etc. The people who attacked him said, quote, "The motherfucking Muslim, go back to your country," as they were beating him. Hate speech is not harmless. Hate speech actually creates an atmosphere of bigotry and intolerance that leads to violent actions such as this man's beating. And it's not a coincidence that this man's beating took place after those ads on the sides of the buses appeared. Another example I want to bring to light that people haven't really been talking about on YouTube is the case of Specialist Zakari Klawan. He is a Muslim soldier stationed at Fort Hood who has been threatened nonstop. He has been harassed nonstop, all because he is a Muslim. After a threatening note appeared on his door with religious slurs, he had to move off base. He had to take out 2 loans, borrow an additional $300 from a nonprofit group, and pawn his possessions to pay his bills because the Fort Hood brass didn't give him a housing allowance to help him pay for his housing off base because it wasn't safe for him to be on base. The military has made quite a number of promises to him, saying that they'll address the issue, that they're going to promote tolerance, that they're going to clamp down on the hate speech and the harassment that he's faced. And all of those have proven to be empty promises. It's no coincidence that the U.S. military is a place where there's a lot of hate speech against Muslims, where there's a lot of Islamophobia. The military has been promoting this kind of thing within its ranks as a matter of policy since 9/11 to help motivate troops into killing large numbers of Muslims in Afghanistan and Iraq without a second thought. One example of how the military is consciously promoting Islamophobia is from Klawan's complaints. On January 13th, in an anti-terrorism presentation, one of the slides explained Islam's beliefs this way, quote, "It is the duty of all Muslims to kill all Americans and Westerners." This quote during the presentation was unattributed. It later turned out that this quote was from Osama bin Laden. So the U.S. military is teaching troops that it is the duty of all Muslims to kill all Americans and Westerners, which are the words of Osama bin Laden, but they're not telling the troops that those are bin Laden's words. So they're misleading troops into thinking that this is what Islam teaches, that this is what Muslims believe. And if you teach people that, and that is your understanding of the relationship between Islam and terrorism, and you get shipped to Iraq and Afghanistan, what do you think is going to happen? I'll show you where this kind of thinking leads.
Unless you were taking fire from it. There was no fire that was taken from that mosque. It was shot into because we were angry. Can you please play the next video?
That Islamophobia actually does lead to real life consequences for people. It really actually does lead to hate crimes and worse. I want to close by saying a couple of things. The first thing is I think everybody should support the right of the Muslim community to build a place of worship near ground zero. That's for starters. And the reason I say that is a couple reasons. Preventing the mosque from being constructed 2 blocks from the World Trade Center would actually be incredibly hypocritical, given that there's a Catholic church that's even closer to ground zero. If Muslims are barred from building a place of worship there, it's going to prove bin Laden right. It's going to prove bin Laden right that the West has no respect for Islam or Muslims. It's going to prove bin Laden right that all this talk about freedom of religion and freedom of speech and all these enlightened liberal democratic values that the West is constantly talking about is all so much hypocrisy. And it's also going to prove bin Laden right in that there is a clash of civilizations between Islam and the West. And unless you agree with bin Laden, or unless you want him to be able to recruit more people into his cause, you should support the Ground Zero Mosque being built 2 blocks from the World Trade Center.